Okay, let's talk about this now. Matters arising out of the publication of the Grenfell inquiry report. Some social housing landlords still treat tenants like children and behave in the same adversarial manner as a Grenfell Tower landlord, the social housing ombudsman had said. Speaking after the publication of the public inquiry report into the 2017 fire that claimed 72 lives, Richard Blakeway called on social housing leaders to see people, not problems. I've been talking about this with Suzanne Muna, who's a founding member of the Social Housing Action Campaign, and Harry Phibbs, a columnist at Conservative Homes, asking whether they agreed with the Ombudsman's assessment and what changes they felt were needed to rebalance the landlord-tenant relationship. I began with Suzanne and asked her whether the Ombudsman's comments reflected her own experience.
Yeah, I mean, SHAC is a grassroots campaign, so we are in contact with tenants and residents from right across the spectrum, from lots of different landlords. And for us, it's absolutely clear that that is the case, that there is this huge power imbalance between tenants and residents on the one hand, and then their landlords. And the tenants could be leaseholders in a sort of lease arrangement with the landlord, or it could be people who are full renters or shared owners. And in all cases, we see problems being caused by this lack of power comparative to the landlords, but for tenants and residents compared to the landlords. And the way that manifests itself is an inability to actually exert their rights. So they have very few rights in the legislation anyway compared to landlords. But even the rights that they do have, it's very, very hard for them to enforce those. And there isn't really any other body or agency that is able to enforce them either. So even the Housing Ombudsman, for example, has found for the last 2 years, I believe, kind of record increases in the number of complaints handling failure orders. So it will make an order to a landlord and the landlord can just ignore it. And then they're trying to get the landlord to go back and address the problem. And actually it's still very difficult for them to address it. And we find the same even with the courts, to be honest. When people actually win a case at tribunal, they can still find it incredibly difficult to actually get the landlord to comply with the court order. And there's no real sanction for the landlord except a fine. And we're dealing with landlords who have got, in Clarion's case, surplus of 285 million, so a small fine from a court is really no sanction at all. So there is a huge enforcement gap as well.
Yeah. There are some members of the previous government, perhaps Michael Gove, who did make sympathetic noises in the direction of renters and tenants, Harry, but they didn't achieve very much while in office in this area. How sympathetic are you to what Suzanne and others have been saying today?
Well, and I'm very sympathetic to Suzanne. I think we probably would agree there's a problem. We'd probably disagree with how to go about it. I mean, what is needed is choice and competition. And at the moment, tenants don't have that. Obviously, the private rented sector, there's a great shortage of accommodation, but in social housing as well. The local authorities and housing associations are themselves typically pretty bad landlords. They're inefficient and they're bureaucratic. I can understand how there's a waiting list for people to get into social housing because there's the advantage of the rent being below the very high market rent, and also there's security of tenure. But if, and obviously over the years, I was a local councillor for many years. I go around and knock on doors. They just be a typical experience knocking on someone's how things are going, any problems with repairs, maintenance, and then they'd immediately say, "Well, come and look at the kitchen, come and look at the bathroom. I've been waiting 6 months." And what should happen is that a landlord should have an incentive to keep the tenant, should want to please the tenant, should want the tenant to choose to stay in the property, and that would be a proper competitive market, and that is completely broken down both in the private rented sector and in the social housing sector.
And Suzanne, what would you say to that? That if there were more competition, then the good social landlords would rise to the top and everybody would want to go with them. The issue then would be what happens to the bad ones. How far would more competition address the issues that you're concerned about?
Well, it's been the entry of more competition, as in private organisations, which is what housing associations are. into the public housing arena that has actually caused these problems. What we need is for tenants and residents, not for more competition, because you will always have a number of people, a section of people who don't have a great deal of choice, that they need social housing, they need public housing that is made available to them. And we can kind of, go into a lot of reasons of why that will be the case. What tenants and residents need is more control. If they had more control, if they had the power to force their landlord to fix things, why should somebody have to move to another landlord because their landlord isn't fixing their bathroom, isn't getting rid of the cockroach infestation or, the rat infestation, and isn't fixing the fire doors? What they should be able to do is stay in their home and have the power to force a landlord to actually make the repairs that they need.
What does that look like then, Suzanne, in terms of laws? The Housing Secretary's saying some very strong things today, as is the Ombudsman. So perhaps there is a fair wind now with the change of government. Yeah. But what would the law look like, the new law, if that came in?
It's not, I want to say it's not just a matter of changing the law, because it's about enforcement as well, about the ability to enforce the law. So, for example, tenants, a lot of housing issues you can't get legal aid for. So the landlord can go into court with their barristers and their solicitors, and that's what we see happening. And the tenant or resident doesn't have any representation because they can't afford it and there isn't legal aid. So there are a whole number of barriers. I mean, there are loads of these barriers. It's not just one barrier that you could easily remove and you would give them access. But just to say about, you mentioned Michael Gove earlier and what the previous government was doing. This is what we mean about the kind of enforcement side of it, the enforcement piece in this equation. The only time that the sanction of withdrawing grant funding from the public purse to these massive landlords that have already got big surpluses was in the case of SHAC's death. Rochdale Borough-wide Housing is the only one that I know of over a number of years that has had grant removed from them. And that was obviously a really high profile and very horrific case. It shouldn't take that much. So that threat should be there. So government has got the ability, has got the levers it can pull. It's just choosing not to pull them at the moment.
Right. So Harry, what we're talking about then is more government intervention, not competition. It's about saying to these social landlords, you get a huge amount from the public purse. We expect a higher standard from you than we might in other parts of the sector. You have to do this or else.
Well, I absolutely think that there should be greater rigor in social housing. There should be transparency. I mean, we're obviously remembering the Grenfell Tower fire. I mean, something like having fire risk assessments all published online. I mean, there should absolutely be a role for that. I think that there could be empowerment of tenants. I mean, one thing you could have is that where some of the minor repairs that tenants could have the power to take responsibility for that, and maybe offer them in return for taking on that responsibility, having that authority to do that, some kind of shared ownership where they got some shared ownership without any payment, but they got a slice of equity in return for taking on responsibility. But the main point is to have far more housing, to have far lower rent just openly in the market, and for people not to be trapped, for there not to be this kind of municipal serfdom where people, however bad their housing association or their landlord is, they feel they've got no escape.
But doesn't Harry, doesn't the current situation demonstrate market failure? People have come in, they want to make profit, they have shareholders, they want part of the public purse, but they want to do as well as they can for their shareholders or their investors. And as we've seen time and again, from what the Kensington Chelsea Tenants Management Association did, or some other organisations have done, they see tenants as militant troublemakers, or let me quote the report from Sir Martin Morbick, and they lost sight of the fact that residents depend on it for a safe and decent home.
No, absolutely not. We do not have a market failure. We have a failure of state control restricting the market. If you're wanting to go and buy more clothes or buy more food, there's no difficulty with the market. But in terms of housing, obviously with the planning rules, we've got very severe restrictions. There isn't a shortage of space. If you go on an aeroplane and look down in the countries, whatever 1%, 2% of the countries built on, there would be a lot of scope for increasing the supply of housing if that supply wasn't constrained by the very severe planning system. So if you had a great increase in market housing, then you would have a lot more choice, a lot more competition, far lower rents, and then people wouldn't need to be trapped in social housing in the way that they are at the present time.
Suzanne, people are talking about this Grenfell report as being a watershed. Let's wait and see if that is the case. What would you like to see happen next?
Well, I think we're all very, very disappointed, all of us within and connected with the social housing sector from the kind of tenant and resident side, are really disappointed that the report didn't actually make any specific recommendations around social housing. So we would like to see government draw those up. It doesn't have to be as part of this report. There's nothing to stop government drawing up a series of recommendations about how it intends to get more accountability into the housing association sector. What we would like to see is far more investment in council housing, because what that would do is to give people a level of democratic accountability over their homes. You will never get everybody. I mean, housing is not even in the most kind of market-driven society, to see housing as purely a commodity. People will always need somewhere to rent. You've got to protect the conditions that those people are renting in. Switching your home is not the same as just choosing a new electricity supplier that takes a few moments online. It's not like, choosing to go to a different supermarket. It's a huge deal to change your home, to move from one home to the next. It can really disrupt your children's education. We have got to protect the people who are renting, regardless of who they're renting from, whether it's a housing association, which is this kind of halfway house, as it were, or a private renter or a council renter. We've got to make sure that everybody is protected and has the right to live in a decent home and a level of control over what happens.
Yep. And so, Harry, finally and briefly, so 40 or so years after Margaret Thatcher introduced this concept of the property-owning democracy, perhaps we need to put a break on that and think more about respecting the rights of those who rent. And many will rent all their lives, and owning a property isn't the be-all and end-all. Let's give them the protection and the security they need.
And some people want to rent. Most of the people don't. Most of the people want to buy. And in terms of Suzanne's point about having somewhere settled where you're not being sent from pillar to post, the best guarantee of that for most people is to have home ownership, and that's why a radical policy to expand the housing supply and to make it cheaper to buy or cheaper to rent, and most people would then have the opportunity to buy and to settle down and to then be able to start a family, to know that they'll be able to be part of that community, and that's the aspiration that people renting privately or people in social housing want to have, and the focus should be on delivering that, and it's completely achievable. It's completely possible if we stop the planning restrictions that are preventing people from building houses.
All right, Harry. That was Harry Phibbs, columnist at Conservative Home, and Suzanne Munya, founding member of the Social Housing Action Campaign.